Sort of fun to be up here. I think I have a calling. My name is John Malloy. I'm the director of the Center for Public Ethics at Waterloo Lutheran Seminary. And I just want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you for this special forum on faith in the Ontario election with our very, very special guest. We're delighted to have Robert Fisher with us here this evening. What we wanted to do as we head towards the start of the official election campaign is we thought it might be useful to provide some context for the upcoming election. What can we as Ontarians expect? What are the themes likely to be? And what is it likely to look like? And to provide that perspective, we could think of no one better than Robert Fisher. So Robert, we welcome you here this evening. We look forward to your insights. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Robert Fisher.
Thank you very much for that introduction, John. It was read just the way I wrote it. And you did it in less than 5 or 6 minutes. Good evening, and thank you for the invitation to be here this evening. It is an honor to be part of this process and a very worthwhile undertaking as we approach the June 7th election in this province. An election that will, in my opinion, define where this province really wants to go and with whom, and perhaps with a federal election on the horizon, the country as well. There is an old curse that often filters through politics, and that is that may you live in interesting times. I think there would be few of us here tonight who would not say that we don't live in interesting times, particularly at the provincial level. To begin with, a couple of full disclosure moments. Number one, I'm a lifelong card-carrying member of the United Church of Canada. This may skew your opinion of my work. And in the decades that I have covered provincial politics, I have been approached by the three main parties to be a candidate or to work for them. But I'm here tonight as living proof that you can resist the siren call of the political side of Queen's Park. The record will show that the first offer for me to become a candidate came from William Grenville Davis, my first premier of so many. I found myself in his office standing one side Mr. Davis with his unlit pipe, which was more prop than anything else, and on this side a young guy by the name of John Tory, who was then Mr. Davis's principal secretary. I see some of the older members of the audience nodding their head. Mr. Davis always was looking to recruit people to be candidates for one particular party. And he turned to me and he took his pipe out and he said, Robert, have you ever thought of running? And I knew that in my hometown of Cornwall, the Conservatives were looking for a candidate. And so I turned to him and my answer was, but Mr. Davis, for which party? In the history of politics, a one-sentence answer has never ended a meeting so quickly as I did with that conversation with Mr. Davis. There were, I guess I'm sort of proud to say this, because nobody really sort of typecast me politically. There were other offers. Mr. Malloy would probably be surprised to hear there were actually offers from the party he used to represent at Queen's Park, but the most intriguing of all came prior to a federal election. I got 2 phone calls, one from the NDP, the other from the then Canadian Alliance, the left and the very right, and they wanted me to run. Now, I had a friend who had a wicked sense of humor, and she said, you know, go after both nominations, because it would be a great story. So tempting as it was, I said no. Also, by way of sort of introduction of who I am, I know most of you have followed my career to the nth degree for all these years. I have covered 11 provincial elections in this province, and so the one coming up in June will be my 12th. The first one was in 1967. I was an 18-year-old kid out of Algonquin College in Ottawa, and pretty overwhelmed by the whole prospect because the government of the day, led by John Robarts, was seeking re-election. Mr. Robarts was this iconic political figure. I screwed up my courage at one point when he was at an event and asked him for an interview. And much to my chagrin, although I sure wish I'd had the tape recorder rolling, he uttered three words. Well, I have to be careful here. With members of the clergy and you folks as well in attendance, let me just say that Mr. Robarts' response to my very genuine and polite request for an interview was not, "Happy birthday, kid." The kid was right, the other two words. Now, if you want the translation, my good friend Steve Paikin wrote an excellent book on Ontario's 17th Premier, and I think page 342 or something, you could find out what Mr. Robarts actually said to me. I'm still sort of shaking about it. As a matter of fact, I was thinking as I drove here today that on election night in 1967, I was assigned to cover a cabinet minister seeking re-election. The gentleman is deceased. But when I arrived at his campaign headquarters and he'd been declared the winner, he wasn't so much drunk with power as he was with the gin that he'd been drinking in the back room. And I was struck as an 18-year-old kid covering my first election that two people had to help this gentleman stand up so he could do the interview. It's still one of those amazing sort of scenes. In my time at Queen's Park, and most MPPs would privately say it was too long, and it was high time that he got out of there, I have witnessed the demise of the Conservatives in Ontario, 42 consecutive years of power in Ontario, the rise of the David Peterson Liberals, the demise of the David Peterson Liberals, the historic 1990 election that brought Bob Rae and his New Democrats to power, the 1995-1999 periods of the Common Sense Revolution starring Mike Harris. Oh, Is it too soon to talk about this? Or I also saw the rebirth of the Liberals under my good and dear friend Dalton McGuinty. A gentleman in the audience was reminding me tonight of an incident that goes back to the 1999 election. I had asked Mr. McGuinty a question. It was, I admit, fully too long. The moderator let me get away with something. But in those days, in those debates, there were no supplementary questions, which all reporters have as their stock and trade. So you had to front-end load the questions. So I went through a litany of things that I thought needed to be answered by the young Liberal leader, and asked at the end of the question whether he thought he was ready for prime time. Because there had been a campaign run by the Conservatives, his picture in front of a lot of question marks, wondering, the Riddler ad, is he ready to be Premier or not? Mr. McGuinty, it turned out, had never been briefed by his people who do these kinds of things before debates, and so he had no answers. So I remember he was on a lectern like this, and he looked down at me and he said, "Thank you for the question, Robert," and then sort of caught himself and went on. There was a great deal of abuse that I took as a result of that question, and there are still some Liberal gatherings I go to where people hiss and say things behind my back, and that was 1999. So sometimes as a political reporter, you're always on the hook for the things that you say. So I witnessed the rise to Dalton McGuinty to power. I saw him leave power. I saw the rise and have covered Kathleen Wynne, who became the first woman Premier of Ontario. And without being partisan here, high time that a woman was the Premier of this province. Yep. Those were family members who applauded. And I have seen, of course, the election of Ontario's first openly gay Premier, which a lot of people had said leading into the 2014 campaign would never happen. However, it is the story of Patrick Brown that ranks right up there as one of the most dramatic of all political stories, one of intrigue, surprise, twists and turns, police investigations, election Ontario investigation, a story of highs and lows, the expected and unexpected, that would have challenged even the most creative of fiction writers, except that it was all fact and it was happening. Brown was the man who was going to bring the Conservatives back to power, since, after all, they have failed to win an election since 1999, and since have snatched defeat from the jaws of victory in election after election after election. I apologize, Walter McLean, but it's a part of the historical record for the Tories. Everything you know was unfolding as it was supposed to for the June 7th election for the Conservatives until about 9:45 on the night of January 24th. A date and time, I was going to say will live in infamy, but will certainly be remembered by Conservatives in this province, when their leader, the presumptive premier in waiting, stood alone behind a mic in front of a group of reporters to tell them he would fight allegations of sexual impropriety. And some hours later, the party and the caucus turned their back on the man who would be premier, and Brown beat a hasty retreat from Queen's Park that would eventually trigger another date and time that will soon not be forgotten by Conservatives, no matter what happens on June the 7th. So fast forward to about 10 days ago, just after 10 p.m. on Saturday night, an announcement that had lingered for hours before the official confirmation that Doug Ford, the one-term Toronto City Councillor, failed mayoralty candidate, brother of the late and, having covered him, very controversial Mayor Rob Ford, and millionaire sign maker, was to be the next leader of the Ontario Conservative Party, or the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party. It was close. Ford was, in this race, clearly the risky choice for the Tories. The safe choice was to be Christine Elliott. She of the popular vote, as it turned out, he of the points game that is part of the Conservatives' ranked ballot system. So while the departure of Patrick Brown marked the end of something, many people within the Conservative Party, within the Liberal Party, within the NDP are now asking, is Doug Ford the beginning of something? Of course, the answer to that question will be left up to the poll that really counts, and that will be on June the 7th. But it is clear, or should be, from Mr. Ford's victory, that he cannot be underestimated as a new force in the Ontario Conservative Party, in politics in this province in general. A man who will play, I think, a key role in the outcome of this election, and in many ways has already begun to set the agenda. The so-called Ford Nation, largely based in West End and East End parts of Toronto, has grown outside the Greater Toronto area. It did during the leadership campaign, and it will continue to grow across the province into the southwest of Ontario, into northern Ontario, growing support with a very simple message that will make Doug Ford, I believe, a very tough opponent for Kathleen Wynne's Liberals and Andrea Horwath's New Democrats. Still, a lot of what Ford has been saying, to be frank, simply doesn't add up. The promise to lower taxes, to cut the size of government, to end political corruption, all the while eliminating carbon pricing without cutting programs or jobs, is little more than wishful thinking. Liberals are already telling people the plan will cost 40,000 jobs. That may be a strategy. They may be right. But keep in mind, in 2014, the thing that caused the Conservative Party in Ontario to lose yet another election was a last-minute promise from the then leader of the party, Tim Hudak, to cut 100,000 civil service jobs in Ontario. A plan that he seemed to have in his head, but was never communicated really to Tory candidates in that election. I've talked to many since then who said they were often blindsided by going to the doorstep looking for people's votes and people asking about this plan that they knew nothing about. Mr. Ford's response to this kind of thing, these kinds of questions, has basically been to say that, like he and his brother did at Toronto City Hall, and even this is open to still some debate, he was going to find and will find as Premier of Ontario efficiencies. That as a businessman, he says he'll be able to find about 4 cents of waste on every dollar out of Queen's Park. That is the kind of messaging that may not make sense to people in this room, or it may, but it does to a lot of voters, because they see Mr. Ford as now their defender at Queen's Park, the guy prepared to take on the so-called elites. You'll hear a lot of that word during the next election campaign when it officially launches. I think May 9th is when the writ is issued, and of course voting day is June the 7th. He's taken on the elites even in his own party, and people like that. The power bases in Toronto, it's time people say, put these folks in their place. If it all sounds familiar, it is because it is familiar. Ford, in a Donald Trump-like moment in time, has tapped into an anger, a disappointment. I think even when you talk to ordinary folks, all anecdotal, it's not scientific, you hear their fears about what lies ahead for them, their children. It is centered with working class Ontarians, with new Canadians, people who genuinely believe that they and their problems have been ignored by the incumbent Liberal government. People who grumble at Tim Hortons, for example, about their hydro rates, and who are telling polling companies, apparently, they have had enough of the Liberals in general and Kathleen Wynne in particular. And just let me digress for 1 second, because in the rest of the presentation, I do talk about polling, because it has become so much a part of elections in Ontario, particularly this one. And I want to offer this caveat. I'm not going to give you a ton of numbers tonight, because it's too much to absorb. You can find this stuff online if you're so interested. But more importantly, to know that when you read in your paper or hear on the radio, and I'm certain you're all listening to Kitchener-Waterloo CBC, particularly Thursday mornings at about 7:10. What's his name, Norris, talented young guy with this old guy doing political commentary. I'd highly recommend it. These are snapshots in time. So when you hear about a poll, it says that if an election were held today, this would be the result. The reality is, and my good friend Steve Pakin and I were talking about this on social media just yesterday, because he did a blog about this, too many people have decided, the polls have decided, that Kathleen Wynne is going to lose, that Andrea Horwath will never be Premier of Ontario, that Doug Ford has an automatic win in this election. But that's based on a poll that was taken maybe 3 days ago, and it's only valid up until the time it's published. So you have to keep that in mind when you hear these polls, because really, in all seriousness, the poll that does only count is the one that happens on Election Day. But when you hear things like, I don't like Kathleen Wynne, I don't like the Liberal Party, you hear things like hydro, you hear complaints about various issues. But the bottom line on all of this is that people must remember that, in fact, this is a government that's been around for 15 years, and its best before date may well be up in this election. So no matter what the Liberals say or do or promise, a lot of people apparently, according to the polls, based on something that happened today that's not happening till June, have made up their minds where their X is going. The polls, these snapshots in time, have not been kind to the Liberals. Even they will acknowledge that, and have been very unkind to the Premier. But while the Tories have been riding a wave of popularity since Patrick Brown was elected leader, the public samplings always left behind this nagging concern that about half of the people in all these polls didn't know who he was. I have lost track of the number of times I've been stopped at Tim Hortons or at Costco or wherever I'm shopping, and somebody taps me on the shoulder and says, "Fisher?" They call me Fisher. I get Mr. Fisher at home, but I get Fisher when I'm out at Tim Hortons, and they say, "I'm going to vote Conservative in the next election." My answer is, "Well, that's fine, you made up your mind." He said, "We got to support what's his name." So that's a problem, and it was for the Tory party, and I think that's what probably, among other things, led them to believe that Mr. Brown simply had to go. They certainly know his name now, but it really doesn't matter, since he won't be a candidate, rejected strangely, and try to follow me through this, by the same group of party executives who recently said he could be a leadership candidate, even though the caucus had expelled him and he was sitting as an independent MPP. Got that? They didn't want him as an MPP, but the party said he could be a leadership candidate. Now, ultimately, Mr. Brown, I think, did the right thing for his party and sat out this leadership race, and that certainly was a relief to many people. More recently, some polling that was done, again, no numbers, just sort of themes for you here, that the Tory lead in the province, no matter how big it is, was likely to be safe under Christine Elliott or Caroline Mulroney as party leader, but really less so if Doug Ford were leading the victory. But after he won, the numbers continue to forecast a Tory majority win and a Liberal defeat. Some of the recent numbers out in the past weekend, for example, reveal the Liberals are in deep trouble in Toronto, an area that has been a political fortress for years and decades, both provincially and federally. But that may be changing. And again, when you're talking to people, it's anecdotal, but you get a sense that, maybe a change is at foot in an area that has been Liberal-led for so long. In fact, now both parties will privately concede that it has become a battleground. And why is that important? Well, to win a provincial election in Ontario, you have to win in the 416 and the 905 because both areas are vote-rich. 519 is important, but it's 416 and 905 that will make a difference. You win there, likely to win the election. Lose there, likely to lose the election. If there's any good news at all, that the Liberal brand is apparently intact, even as people are not happy with Miss Wynne. And for Andrea Horwath, just the opposite has happened. And it has happened in the 2014 election, and it's happening now as we approach the 2018 election. She continues to be very popular with voters. You go to an event and you can see the reaction of the audience. They like her, they like what she's talking about, but those numbers, that support doesn't stretch down into the NDP caucus, into the New Democratic Party. So the party is facing the prospect of yet another third-place finish. The pollsters say voters don't see the NDP as an opposition party that is a real option for voters on June the 7th. Ms. Horwath and her party, if you've been following the news at all, will know that they're going to work very hard to change that. They're trying to appeal now to progressives. Many of you out there who may have voted Liberal in 2014 have become disenchanted with Ms. Wynne and are looking for another place to go. That's where the NDP hopes to get votes besides their own. And they're looking, I think, too, as well, to become the middle ground between the Kathleen Wynne Liberals and the Doug Ford Tories. And a lot of people, quite frankly, when you talk to them privately, are sort of scared by that prospect. The NDP has come out with a dental care plan, expanded pharmacare, and lo and behold, in the throne speech of yesterday, who has a dental care plan for people 65 and over, like yours truly, who doesn't have a dental plan, and a pharmacare plan that would be expanded beyond its original concepts from the Liberals, the Liberal Party of Ontario. It's sort of become an election, I think, because in the throne speech, if you followed it at all, you heard about home care and health care and child care and long-term care. For me, it's sort of become the Care Bears versus the big bad wolf. And people are going to have to decide in this election. It'll be up to people like you to decide, do I want the care, or do I think it's time for the cuts? Ms. Horwath is already talking about being the alternative, and you're going to hear over the next weeks and months, her talk about she is the alternative between the bad, in her view, Kathleen Wynne, and the worse, Doug Ford, hoping for another 1990 election when you may remember that there was a scandal-plagued Liberal government in power, headed by David Peterson. There was a one-time golf pro from North Bay named Mike Harris, who had just been elected Conservative leader, just had assumed the reins of the party, really, but he hopped on a campaign bus. And so the choice then ended up that people grew as a protest movement. And again, on this election in particular, in 1990, when that election campaign began, David Peterson was set to be re-elected. But a protest grew up over what had happened to his government and concerns about the lack of experience by the then new Tory leader. And they elected Bob Rae in the NDP, a man who I've always said wanted to be premier in the worst way and got his wish. The economy went south, and ultimately after 5 years, so did his government. But beyond the headlines of the polls and beyond the news stories that you will hear, have heard, will hear in the weeks ahead, it's important to remember several factors that these polls do not look at, do not examine, do not drill down into. Not the least of which is the fact, and this is historic fact, that Kathleen Wynne, whatever you think about her, has always been underestimated in her political career. She was told she'd never win election to Queen's Park in the first place because she was running against a gentleman by the name of David Turnbull, who was a well-known Conservative cabinet minister, and she defeated him. In subsequent elections, she faced John Tory, then the provincial Conservative leader, and was told, "You'll never beat John Tory, look for another job." Then she was told she would never run for or win the leadership of the Liberal Party. And I can tell you, this came from Liberals. And then she was told, well, you might be leader of the party, you'll never win a provincial election. So all through her career, time and time again, she has proven to people in her own party and elsewhere that she can win. And that determination, and believe me, she is a very determined person. She herself says she's stubborn. I'll ask Mr. Malloy later about that. Coupled with a lot of experience, carries into the election a very formidable sort of campaign strategy and a campaign persona, and supported by a very strong, what they call the Liberal ground game, the Liberal organization, which is heavily supported by federal Liberals as well. Still, when you talk privately to Liberal insiders, as I do, they will admit that it's going to be an uphill climb for Ms. Wynne, and concede that perhaps the best case scenario might be a minority government, the worst being a massive defeat that some polls, as I've said, have actually forecast. You know, one of the things that I find when I talk to people in various parts of the province, they always get around to asking, and that is minority government. What do you think of minority government? Minority government is difficult on politicians, but it's often, in my experience, been the type of government, the form of government that responds to the public demand for various things to be done, and the parties must cooperate to get them done. You look at the period with David Peterson and Bob Rae, the accord that brought the Liberals to power and the defeat of Frank Miller and the Conservatives. There was more accomplished in that 2-year period before the next election than I had seen in the previous 10 years, because it had provided a roadmap for the Liberals to keep Mr. Peterson sort of on the straight and narrow and out of the ditch, because he could guarantee himself support from Bob Rae and the NDP. Environmental Bill of Rights, equal pay for work of equal value, major issues that had been often shunted aside until the situation politically dictated that two parties had to come together to get things done. The Liberals wanted to face Patrick Brown in the June election. They believed he was a weak leader. But now they have a Ford in their future and a wild card in many respects to deal with. Mr. Ford, surprising many people, and this reporter included, ran a very disciplined leadership campaign. A campaign run by a very talented campaign manager and team behind him. The question now I would ask, and Conservatives are asking this as well, mostly privately, because Mr. Ford won, of course, and in politics, victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat is an orphan. So suddenly, Mr. Ford has a lot of very new friends out there who want to be part of his team. But can he stick to the script, and can he stay on message? Will he portray himself as a moderate? These are all things that are being worked on now by his campaign. And the answer to the questions about how he will conduct himself can be answered with a yes or a no. And I give you as an example a recent CBC radio interview where Mr. Ford was asked some very difficult questions. There's no doubt about it. And he had been Tory leader at that point by his own admission for 50 hours. But, you know, the campaign is underway. You have to be ready to answer these questions because the public is demanding answers. So he resorted, when he didn't have answers, to his favorite approach was to bully or try to bully the woman who was asking the questions. Time and time again, Mr. Ford belittled her with what I would argue was a disgraceful performance by a provincial party leader. The optics, to me, as a listener, as someone who has followed politics all of his life and has a great deal of respect for politicians in all parties, even those who haven't asked me to run. But that's Mr. Ford's style, and it's an approach that has spawned some of the most disgusting sexist and homophobic slurs ever launched against an individual, and I'm speaking here of Kathleen Wynne. Social media has captured the political scene these days, and people vent in terrible ways, saying things about her, and often, sadly, other women politicians become targets. Words that I wouldn't repeat here. I wouldn't even repeat privately, but I read them, I see them, I'm sent notes about them. You know, it would be easy to go on social media and find comments like, jail Kathleen Wynne, just as in the United States, you can still find comments about jail Hillary Clinton. So how will Mr. Ford handle the scrutiny of an election campaign, that hothouse of reporters on a bus traveling across the province, asking him questions every hour at every stop? How will they keep him from freelancing policy, which already has some conservatives out there worried? He's talking about privatizing the sale of cannabis in the province, something that would not sit well, I would dare say, with the PC party base, who are concerned about the proliferation, of drugs. Or what about an end to rent controls? Another example of letting the free market exist to dictate what's going on in our housing. Or how about the Trump-like boast that he will sweep the province on June the 7th, winning the largest ever majority? That may well be true. But no leader, in my experience, makes that claim when you've only been on the job for 50 hours. And interestingly, and I think importantly, when people go back and look at the Conservative Convention, and because there was so darn much time waiting for the results to come, that a lot of people got a chance to speak that may not have been heard from, among them former premiers, Ernie Eves, Mike Harris, and others, who said to CBC reporters and CTV reporters, this party should not take these polls for granted. This party must earn the victory on June the 7th, not just simply show up and expect to win. And getting to that point means that Mr. Ford is going to go through the leaders' debate, if he agrees to one, a debate that will see him face off against, and this is the other part that is not covered by polling, two tough and experienced women in Kathleen Wynne and Andrea Horwath. Ford's macho, I have all the answers attitude will be on display for the entire province to see at one time in that 90-minute exchange with the other leaders. So many tests lie ahead for Mr. Ford, and while his shoot-from-the-hip style plays very well with the Conservative base, one wonders how it will play for the rest of the province as they begin to judge who will be the next premier of this province. Tory strategists have talked to me and said, look, bring it on. The less scripting for Doug Ford, the better. But I really wonder about that. Somebody like Bill Davis used to say that bland works. And he certainly made it an art form. But he also got elected and reelected and was an incredible premier in my view. And just while I'm on that point, a lot of people have said to me in recent weeks, this party is made up of these terrible people. I've had people say to me, there's these scumbags that run the Conservative Party. And I tell them that, that's not true. One of the things that's always kept me from being a candidate for a particular party is that I just don't know who I'd support, quite frankly, because I see the good and the value in all people who run for all parties. There are very good conservatives. There will be good conservatives elected on June the 7th, people who will make a really solid contribution to the life of this province, as there will be liberals and Democrats as well. Some very good people will be defeated on June the 7th and will not be part of the process. So this election, like most, is about the hearts and minds of Ontarians. It will be fought on what this province stands for, its expectations, and most of all, its values. But whose values? Doug Ford's, Kathleen Wynne's, Andrea Horwath's, Mike Schreiner's. Whose values will be at stake in that polling decision? And this is where you come into the equation. And I congratulate you for coming here tonight to sit and talk about this issue, to be involved in it, because it's really important. As clergy and lay people, you would be concerned about changes in Ontario, where we're going, have a vested interest in seeing, as John mentioned off the top, in fairness for all, to ensure that nobody is left behind, that healthcare is protected and improved, that the education system is able to respond to needs, that teachers are not walking a picket line, but in the classroom teaching. We've been through this movie, we've seen this movie before, and we know the outcome, and a sequel could well be in the making. So I'm here tonight partly to tell you about the years I covered at Queen's Park, but also to tell you that your voices are important. They are needed and they will be listened to. The fact that you have come here tonight is an indication of your commitment to raising concerns about the issues of the day, whether it's poverty, the lack of affordable housing, the state of the environment, the opioid crisis, the alarming increase in the murder of women and their children by former partners. You know, for me, because of my job, I can't get involved in causes. I can make sure that certain stories are covered, certain events are covered, and that's where I guess you could say I have a bias. And one of those has always been about the issue of poverty. And a story that I was thinking about today as I drove here along the boring 401 until I hit all your damn construction. Is the 401 ever to be finished, or is this an ongoing project? But I digress, and I shouldn't make light of this. A number of years ago, as a television reporter, I spent a morning at a children's breakfast program in Toronto. It's an experience I'll never forget. There were about 30 young children in this classroom and about 4 women who took care of these kids, and they came in and they sat down, they had breakfast, they had a glass of milk, they had juice, they had kind of a McMuffin type thing, they had some nutrition. And when you talk to the women who run this program, it was very clear very quickly that a lot of these kids had not eaten the night before, that this was perhaps the only meal of the day they were going to get. But these women were determined to make sure that that didn't happen, and the thing that has left this indelible impression in my mind, when these kids were leaving this room, the women knew the children who would not have perhaps more than a bag of potato chips for dinner, if they were lucky. And they would just quietly hand another paper bag of food to the children they knew were in that situation. It was one of the saddest things I'd ever seen, and one of the most enlightening things that I, to this day, and this happened probably 20 years ago, I've often wondered, while governments of various stripes have dealt with this issue and moved the yardstick some, it's still such a huge problem in Ontario. In a great province like this, where thousands of children go to bed hungry every night, this is not acceptable, and it must be dealt with. But we haven't heard any talk so far in the campaign about the issue of poverty. You know, when this breakfast program is underway, I remember talking to some people, and they said, isn't this great that we've got these programs to feed the kids, but didn't see that the programs were there because the need was great. One of the things that I was most proud of working at the CBC, and there are many things to be proud of working at the CBC, even though some of my neighbors in Eastern Ontario think I worked at the Communist Broadcasting Corporation. The thing that I was proudest of was the Christmas time, pre-Christmas open house, a program called Sounds of the Season, where every December 7th or 8th, we opened the building downtown Toronto. There's one in Kitchener, they do one in Sudbury, Thunder Bay. It's all over the country really now. And they raise thousands and thousands of pounds of food, and I would say over the years, millions of dollars to help the needy, to help food banks in the Greater Toronto Area, because the need is so great. And politicians of all stripes show up, and they make a contribution. They bring some cans of beans and macaroni and cheese, but they don't bring an answer to this problem. And call me naive, but I think there can be an answer to this, that we should not, as a society, be judged on how we mistreat our children or our seniors, that these kids deserve a better start in life. And so while some of you may be sitting out there thinking, well, what can I do? You know, it's just one voice. I think it's important to know that, in fact, while it'll take time and it'll take a lot of patience, it's important to get involved. Just a quick little story, because I'm probably running out of time. In 2010, the Harper government closed the prison farms around the Kingston, Ontario area to, in my opinion, further punish inmates, denying them really important skills when their incarceration ended. And the churches in the Kingston area and their congregations and their communities stood up and said, this, Mr. Harper, is not acceptable, and we're going to fight you on this because it's an important issue. Now, it took a long time, and it took a second government. But 3 weeks ago, Bill Morneau, the federal finance minister, tabled a budget and included in that budget about $4.5 million to reopen the prison farms in the Kingston area. It was the churches, it was their congregations, people like you who came together and said, we're not going to accept this. And they have changed the situation. So the farms are, I think, slated to open sometime next year. So you can be involved and you can make change. You know, people say to me now as I travel the province, can Doug Ford get elected premier? And my answer is, absolutely he can. If you don't want that, if you want the Wynne government re-elected, if you want an NDP government in Ontario, sitting on the sidelines in this election is not an option. There are clear choices that have to be made on June the 7th. And your voices on various issues, you pick the issue, you get out there and sell it, are very important voices to be heard. And they will be. It'll take time and, as I say, patience, but it's important for you to take part in the process. And tonight is the beginning, in my opinion, of that involvement. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And thank you for your involvement already. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to try and answer them. Thank you very much.